That usually quiets the crowd. Uh-oh, they can hear me.
Go back when you say like.
Maybe we should start doing that.
It's really hidden, the microphones in here, but that's something.
2, 1. All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session of our Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee. Today, we have one item on our agenda, and that is to discuss the resolution to establish the Infrastructure Funding Work Group. We have a draft of the resolution that we held a public hearing. We've gotten feedback from members of the community, from our colleagues on the council. And today our goal is to go through this draft to make additional recommendations and changes before it goes before the full council. And just as a reminder, this is something we discussed on this committee and with the full council while we were doing the impact taxes and the growth in infrastructure policy in the fall. And I know this is something that the planning department and the planning board has also expressed support of and put in their report when we were doing the growth in infrastructure policy. To help walk us through this and navigate all these issues, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Dew.
Good morning, committee. So public hearing was held on February 25th. We had several speakers, people submitted correspondence, and everybody was in support who submitted testimony, but there were requests for several changes. So the resolution, as noted, was introduced back in January, and I will first start on page 2 with what was in the resolution overall. So first, it set a goal of the work group, which is to recommend strategies to fund infrastructure and growth-related needs in the county. And then the resolution had 2 objectives for achieving that goal. First was that the work group should determine and assess the county's infrastructure needs. And then second, research a variety of funding mechanisms to fund that infrastructure. The resolution did list members of the work group, which included several county departments and agencies, and then Montgomery County Public Schools and the State Highway Administration. Lastly, the resolution asked the work group to report to the GO committee sometime between December and March as like a halfway, where are we at? So the committee can correct course if necessary. And then a final report due by June 2026. The intent there was to make sure that there's time to incorporate any policies, do any legislation before the 2028-2032 growth and infrastructure policy, which sounds far, but it won't feel that far as the time passes. So I'm going to pause here to note the structure of the packet. So the way I did this is I divided it into the various questions that have been asked. So first, it's a summary of what's in the introduced version, and then requested changes, and then I'll go through the staff recommended discussion points and pause as needed. So the first is actually a bit of a formatting change recommendation from council staff on what the goal of the work group should be. Something that's been heard through questions and testimony that I've received is questions about the scope and focus of the work group, whether it's too broad, too narrow. So looking back at the resolution, I realize it doesn't actually say like goal, objective. And so the recommendation here is to just label those 2 pieces so that it's clear the difference between the 2.
Okay. All right, Councilmember Friesen.
What? Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, the conversation started with impact taxes and whether impact taxes were the best way to generate revenue. And it's broadened substantially from there to include infrastructure broadly of how do we pay for infrastructure, which impact taxes pay a relatively small amount of. And then the question is, what is infrastructure? Because we're talking about impact taxes.
We're talking about the formatting question, not
So if we're just talking about having a goal and an objective as part of the resolution, that's fine. But then we have to talk about what is the goal.
That's the next point. So the first point was a recommendation from the staff just to be clearer in the delineation how it's formatted.
Okay.
And then we're going to get into.
So I was just going to say, because I don't want to gloss over that, because that is
right.
one of the
No.
existential questions.
Yes,
Right.
it is.
So on page 2 of the resolution, basically before the first sentence, it'll say goal, and then before it starts numbering, it will say objectives is the
Right.
recommendation.
So this is just a format.
For the formatting change.
Got it.
Yeah. And then we're gonna get into
Perfect segue.
question of the hour.
Yeah, question number 2, good segue,
Yeah.
is what should the objectives be? And I combined this question with how should infrastructure be defined, because it will be defined in those objectives. So I'm actually just gonna read them here. So the work group has 2 objectives. The first, as written in the introduced version, is to determine and assess the county's various infrastructure needs with an emphasis on schools and transportation infrastructure to include net new infrastructure repairs and upgrading existing infrastructure to levels that meet anticipated future demand. So the idea here is first, the work group should figure out what are the infrastructure needs, that they could look at other needs, but should really focus on schools and transportation. And then the second objective is to research a variety of funding mechanisms to fund future infrastructure needs. The work group must consider new funding mechanisms in addition to reform of the current impact tax system. The objective is a funding mechanism that is equitable, predictable, and sustainable. So those are the 2 objectives in the introduced version. A couple things to note here. Is that while the resolution keeps the emphasis on schools and transportation, the idea is they can look at other things. We received a lot of recommendations on this one, as Councilmember Friedson noted. I'll read through each one very quickly and then pause there for committee discussion. So first, the county executive recommended striking repairs. So the focus is only on new infrastructure. The Commission on Aging recommended including care and health infrastructure. The planning board recommended including climate resilience, utilities, undergrounding, water, sewer, and telecommunications. And then individuals who testified recommended including Montgomery College, parks, libraries, rec centers, police and fire stations, stormwater management, telecommunications, and climate resilience. So I guess this is going to be a thing that will probably come up often during this discussion. It's a very long list and the work group does need to issue a final report at some point. So the broader the list is, it might deter from how productive the group can be in terms of focusing in on the final report. So that's just something overarching for the committee to consider. So if you go to the top of page 4, I set out 2 questions for committee discussion. The first is whether the committee whether the work committee should determine whether the work group should consider repairs. And then second is a recommendation from council staff. If you don't want to add the whole long list, what you could do is add to the resolution, here's the list of requests we received, and have the committee decide, or have the work group, decide whether in the future the council should consider those as infrastructure. So that way they focus on schools and transportation, but can sort of comment on the various requests that were added. One note here, the way impact taxes work, they're tied to development.
Okay.
So that's why it was schools and transportation, because you know, you build a building, you're gonna have an impact on schools and transportation, which isn't to say that you're not gonna need parks or libraries or those other needs, but it's not as immediate and definite as every time you build a building, if the intent is to still keep this tied to development. And second, that some of these things the council does not fund, such as utilities and telecommunication. So those are various thoughts from council staff, and I will pause here for the committee.
Great. And I think I will pick up on the last point you made, and I think where Councilmember Friedson might be going is, while I appreciate the input from folks, I think this committee, this work group, needs to stay focused on what we fund here. Because if we go talking about utilities and other things that, as a county, we don't fund right now and don't build, that to me is way beyond the scope of this work group. And there are things that were brought up, like stormwater, where we have dedicated funding already for stormwater projects. So and maybe there needs to be some tweaking in the draft resolution we have now, the fact that it talks about infrastructure needs with an emphasis on schools and transportation. And if we want to fine tune that a bit, but I think we need to make sure that this is focused on things that we can tie to development that is also projects that the county would fund. and not make it so broad that we're looking at infrastructure too broadly. Because there's no way this group is going to be able to figure out how in the time we're giving them a funding mechanism in the direction we should go and have actual actionable recommendations. So I don't know, Councilmember Friedson, you had started.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I agree generally with the point. I actually think we should narrow the language even further. I think some of the confusion is we talked about general infrastructure, but with a focus on, and I think we just need to focus on, because ultimately, if we allow the committee to weigh in, there's going to be interest among the committee, understandably. There's going to be interest among the stakeholders who are engaged as part of this process to broaden the scope to utilities and to stormwater and to services for our older adults and for our youngest children. And I think that is beyond where we started. We started to talk about impact taxes and whether that is an appropriate mechanism to fund schools and transportation. It's not something that funds all of schools and transportation. I think we've kind of gotten into that dynamic where we have created certain expectations that aren't based on the current state of reality. But I think ultimately focusing on that. And then the question is it to fund all of schools and transportation? Is it the entire capital budget? I think that's a subsequent question we should ask. And I just want to put that down, but I actually think we should tighten the language here to make it very clear. There could be a working group for each one of these subsections. Right. You could even argue that transportation and schools could each have their own work group because they're such big topics. All the other suggestions that have been made, I think, are important, but at a certain point, I do think we need to provide a reasonable opportunity for this group to have productive conversations and to give us useful recommendations. And I think we need to narrow it as a result.
Thank you. I'm pretty much in agreement, though I do think it doesn't have to necessarily be what is funded. As an example, utility easement. That for the infrastructure, there has to be some mechanism that the group that is developing has those easements in there, and they need to be looking at that as we're doing it. I think if we put all of these issues in at the same time, there's the expression that if you bite off more than you can chew, you can't chew. And that's exactly what will happen. We'll end up with nothing rather than what our goals are. And for the whole thing about repairs, there's not all repairs just mean potholes. And I don't know, as an example, how state highway, and I can't remember how they, and Mr. Dyson planning is here, maybe they can give me the example, but I think in some cases, if you go to state highway and say, we'd like you to fix this part of it, they say, well, we have funds for repairs, we can take that. And it's not really a repair. I mean, it's actually, so I don't know how we can word it, but I do believe that if somebody during the infrastructure conversation, that if they can come up with things that are needed, whatever the definition is, we need to know it. So.
Okay. So in the executive's letter, the way it was phrased was to remove repairs and include things that bring existing infrastructure up to current standards. And of course, think from the zoning perspective, people might differ on what's a repair versus a renovation. So for instance, if you're like upgrading the HVAC or something like that, maybe that's a repair if it's leaking. But if you want to make it environmentally friendly and make all these changes for modern day, that's closer to a renovation. So the question here would be for repairs, if you want to remove it, how is the committee defining repairs? And it might relate to how it's defined in the CIP.
Yeah, I think the first question is what is included, broad scale. So I think we have to answer that. Is it just transportation and schools, and is that the list? Full stop. I think that's question one. I think question two then becomes within schools and transportation, what is included? If we're focusing on development and we're focusing on the growth and infrastructure policy and preparing a report to provide the council with information leading into the growth and infrastructure policy, that's focused on capacity. That's school capacity and that's transportation capacity. That is the purpose of what impact taxes are intended to do. I don't think impact taxes are a good way to do it, but that is the intention. There's a difference between capacity and state of good repair, maintenance, repairs, all infrastructure needs en masse. Then you're getting into the challenge where you're asking one project or a small number of new projects to fund the entire infrastructure needs of a 1.1 million person county, which is just completely unreasonable. So I think we need to really focus in here on what is the problem we're trying to solve. What is the paradigm we are in, and what is the arena that we're focused on? Because if the arena is too big, no one will understand what they're being asked to do. So I think we should respectfully decide formally of whether or not we are just focusing on schools and transportation, number one. And then number two, is this about capacity? Is this about replacement of impact taxes? Or is this about all of transportation needs and all of school needs? Because that's a bigger lift. And there are larger questions related to that.
So let's take the first one, because I think we're generally in agreement, but not 100%. So what I'm hearing from the committee is not wanting to go as broad as people wanted, but to focus on schools and transportation. The question I have for my colleagues, because I would just like to have a conversation on, is it just limited to schools and transportation? Or do we think about like parks and rec as well in that? Because as we've had conversations, and even just looking at the Bethesda minor master plan and thinking about the conversations we've had there with the PIP and parks, I would say there could be an argument for this work group to consider, not have to look at, but consider whether or not, as we're looking at funding for schools and transportation in these infrastructure conversations, should we also be looking at recreation? Again, thinking about Bethesda and a rec center there, and also thinking about parks. So that is a question I have. And again, I do not want to broaden this too big, but I think there could be an argument for this work group to consider and then report back to us whether or not we should be including recreation and parks. Councilmember Cathcart.
I actually agree with that. I think that the question is, when do you look at it? And I think if they're going to have this work group look at it, I believe that as narrow a focus as we can have. I believe it should be transportation, schools, and parks and rec, or whatever, however the term. And of course, the county would be the one to fund parks. So I think that's fair. But I do believe that the word nexus has to come in here somewhere. That there has to be a nexus to what the development or whatever is doing. I mean, to your point earlier, they can't, if you're building an apartment building, you can't have enough infrastructure for the entire county. You can certainly take care of what's in front of your property and to the next intersection or however you do it. But I think that the three items would be the best. And because if you start getting into when you're going to build a library, who's going to pay for the library, this group can't figure, we can hardly figure that out at times. They certainly can't. So I'm good with the three.
Councilmember.
Yeah, I really appreciate the suggestion. I'm thinking about it. I think adding parks makes sense, especially given that we do have in Bethesda as an example, a park impact payment related specifically to development.
Yeah.
So that is not an impact tax, but it is a similar version that has been used. It may be utilized in other places in future master plans. While I have been a major champion of the Bethesda
Parks and Rec,
Bethesda Rec Center, and I continue to advocate for that, that nexus is a little bit less clear because we don't have a development by development funding mechanism, and I don't think there's one that would be proposed in order to require it. There is an a recommendation within the minor master plan amendment in Bethesda to provide public benefit points and to make that a major public amenity. And so dedicating part of a building or part of a property in order to do that. There are other examples of that for schools and others, but I think that is a little bit different than, you know, an actual charge related to development. We had something similar when we took back up the Silver Spring plan at the end of the last council, not impact taxes, but where, you know, charges for density, et cetera. So I think schools, transportation, parks, I think exclusively, I think would make sense. I think it's a good suggestion. And I think that would tie it specifically to the things that we are charging for development and whether or not that is the appropriate way to fund it.
Would you like to specifically say schools, transportation, parks, or say schools and transportation and consider whether parks should be included as well? You want to just tell them parks is in?
I like to tell them, but
I think, yeah.
Okay.
I think the clearer we can be, the better.
I think, yes, I agree.
Okay, so if you go to the resolution, a proposed amendment for number 1 on page 2 of the resolution would be the work group will determine and assess the county's schools, transportation, and parks infrastructure needs to include, and I'll dot here as you discuss with pairs.
Can I just add one? You know, and I agree with exactly what you just said, but just because this group would be the first group to be looking at things, doesn't mean it has to be the only group at times. Once they do the work and we get there, then the next group can be looking at the other parts of the infrastructure as well, the recreation, the libraries and all of that.
Yeah. And I think I agree with that. And I just want to say, for the record, because I know we had a lot of conversation and I really do appreciate the planning department and the planning board's questions because, you know, when we were talking about the growth and infrastructure policy, we were talking about impact taxes. We had that long list of things and we debated back and forth about, do we give, you know, an exemption for undergrounding utilities and all those things. To me, the conversation we just had is the broader framework for how this work group is going to approach their work. And some of those other issues, I still think can be part of that conversation. But they're a subset for me of what are we focusing on in terms of what are we looking, and we'll get to whether or not it's fully funded capacity in a moment, but what are these monies going towards? And I think having that overarching framework of looking at schools, transportation, parks, I think is important to focus the conversation. And I would imagine that as this work group is going on, that there will be conversations about climate resiliency and other things, but that it's within that framework. You good? Okay. I only wrote down capacity when you had your other thing. So it was discussing capacity, fully funding the infrastructure. And I feel like you had a third thing.
Well, and whether or not this is focused on replacing development charges. I mean, the repairs is a broad question to that as well. But there is a question here of, it is enough of a bear just to decide how are we going to replace impact taxes, if that is the direction that we want to go with. There's an even bigger question of how do we fund infrastructure needs related to schools, transportation, and parks. I think that's a big question. If the scope is related to the growth and infrastructure policy, I think we can focus in on that of, you know, funding related to the growth and infrastructure, you know, policy. I think we could do it based on capacity. I think it's going to be very difficult if the goal here is to ask this group to come up with how do we fund all transportation, how do we fund all schools, how do we fund all parks. I think you're going to need a blue ribbon panel in about a decade, and I think you'd be hard pressed to get something that would be, you know, particularly actionable in the time frame that we have allotted.
you know, Ed Bohr, who was mayor before me in Gaithersburg, used to have the expression, I want you to dream a little. You know, don't worry about how we're gonna do it. Just give me the dream. And I think that's almost what we should be asking this group to do. If we're asking them to do all of that, I don't know that they can come up with their best suggestions because they're gonna say, look, we'd like you to do this, but we know you can't afford to. I think we should let them dream, see how this works, let it come back, and then have the discussion about how we're gonna pay for things. Because first off, right now, we're all in flux. We have no idea how we're gonna be paying for some of the things. And so I don't want to handcuff them so that this group can't come back with their best suggestions.
Yeah, I think I lean towards what Councilmember Katz said, because I want to give enough direction, but then also allow the work group to then come back to us with suggestions, because I'm personally not looking at this work group just to say like, okay, how can we tinker with impact taxes? And improve them. I do want it to be broader than that. And so it's not just looking at tinkering with impact taxes, but thinking about our infrastructure as we grow in these three areas and how are we going to fund it? Some of that is from development, but if there are other ideas that they want to propose to us, then I think we should keep that on the table.
For the record, I don't want to tinker with impact taxes.
Right.
I want to get rid of impact taxes. I think I pretty well documented. I think it's a country club mentality that puts a wall rather than a welcome sign. It's inconsistent with our broader public policy goals and interests. And I think it's an unpredictable and fairly lousy way to fund things that are so important like schools, transportation. That notwithstanding, I understand the point. I do think that the broader the guidance, the more challenging it's going to be to focus and to come up with a consensus. Even if the goal, the end goal here isn't to have a singular recommendation, it's to have a series of options to present to the council, which we'll get to in a minute too. But the broader it is, the harder it's going to be. And I am a little concerned about that. I will just note that. But if ultimately there was an interest, I at least think we should think long and hard of talking about capacity, broadly capacity, rather than impact taxes. Because if we're talking about the entire schools transportation CIP and the parks CIP, I mean, it's a huge undertaking to ask. So the compromise would be focusing on capacity rather than just, replacement of impact tax, which is a fairly, insignificant percentage of the overall budget. School capacity needs are a huge need. That in and of itself, a group could just do that. Transportation capacity is a major issue. In and of itself, a group could just do that. How exactly you frame that for parks, I think is a little bit trickier because I'm not sure, that historically hasn't been how we have assessed parks. It's a little bit clearer to me on school capacity and on transportation capacity. But I think we have to find some way to narrow this and focus this, or else it is going to be very difficult to have an understanding, a clear understanding between the council, the executive, the stakeholders, and the people who are actually being asked to do this work on this work group of what their job is.
So what if we change the second objective to say, to research a variety of funding mechanisms to fund future capacity needs for schools, transportation, and parks infrastructure? So instead of just saying mechanisms to fund future infrastructure needs, and then keep the rest the same.
Say it one more time, please.
To research a variety of funding mechanisms to fund future capacity needs for schools, transportation, and parks. So it goes with
I'm good with it.
Is that,
I think that would work. That works for the attorney. You gotta ask your
That does
lawyer.
I was gonna change the second sentence, but I actually like that better.
oh, okay.
You see, you ask the attorneys and they have an opinion. I don't know.
And then the last two sentences will keep the same.
I mean, you could take out in addition to reform of the
Yeah, you
current
could.
impact tax system, because we just take that, like,
Yeah.
don't even,
Well, but I think that's the reason they're here.
yeah.
Yeah, I think
You
that
get it?
helps to at least,
Yeah.
that is a key focus. Doesn't have to be the
Yeah.
only focus, but that is a key.
Yeah.
A key objective that, the end of this is, we started with this saying we
Yeah.
want to get rid of impact taxes and have a better funding mechanism that's more predictable, more sustainable, and more equitable, in that sense. I'm also, sorry,
No, I was gonna just say, the third sentence, I'm wondering if we should make it funding mechanisms and not wedded to plural. Because does it sound like if we just say a funding mechanism, that we're trying to just
That's good.
replace
I agree. with that.
impact taxes? Or again, our goal here, all three of us, the entire council, is says we do not want to just tinker with impact taxes. So I hadn't read it that way until we were just having this
Right.
conversation.
Yeah, I agree.
Makes sense.
I think it should be.
So the
more.
objective is funding mechanisms that are equitable, predictable, and
Yeah.
sustainable.
yeah, and I'm just wondering, as part of the objective, whether there should be a reference to balancing the capacity needs with housing needs, or with, because that is part of the, I mean, you could just set a really high rate for anything. But it would have an impact. The impact would be you might shut down development, or, or housing, or, whatever the case may be. I'm just wondering whether or not, that should be included.
So how would you include it? And I'm jumping in and you.
No, you're good, you're good. It's this room.
Yeah. My concern is that the more we limit to what the discussion's gonna be for them, is the less
Well,
that we're gonna get back.
yeah, I don't think it's limiting. I think that it's just making clear. I mean, I think it's understood, but it's not written anywhere. So, I think you could say the objective is funding mechanism. It is funding mechanisms that are equitable, predictable, and sustainable. And
do not, and this is not the words, but it's like undermine other county goals such as housing and climate resiliency.
yeah,
And
without undermining,
That's good.
without undermining other county priorities, including housing and climate resilience.
And would you also include economic development?
Sure. Sure.
housing,
Housing,
climate
climate
resilience.
resiliency.
I mean, if we're gonna give them this hard thing to do, let's make it harder, but
Should it be housing production or housing?
I think just housing.
You just keep it housing.
So the objective is funding mechanisms that are equitable, predictable, and sustainable without undermining county priorities such as housing, climate resiliency, and economic development.
Sure.
They used to always say that if you have a committee, try to come up with how you get a horse, you end up with a camel.
We didn't say this was gonna be an easy assignment.
Very thin needle here. Yeah, it is. And this is our committee recommendation, then it goes to
It's
full
going to
council, and then.
But
we'll-
Might have an opinion or
Yes.
two.
All right, so on the very specific question of adding the word repairs or not, I don't know, I'm kind of I'm not, I guess I'm not completely seeing the objective to including the word repairs, but so I'm not.
And right after repairs, it says upgrading existing infrastructure to levels that meet anticipated future demand. I think because of that second part, you might not need the repairs since it's already factored in upgrading infrastructure if
Yeah.
needed.
I think the reason it was put in there or whatever, it is that we do hear from folks that like even before thinking about this, what we have currently actually isn't meeting the needs. So I think that's what the word repairs, whereas it's not even just looking to the future, but it's actually thinking about the area. But I do, and again, if we're exploring this as not just what developers pay for this area, but other funding mechanisms as well, I think you could argue keeping repairs in there.
My concern candidly is what the definition of repairs. That's the problem to me. I mean, if they're upgrading an intersection, is that a repair? I don't know.
So I think this is easier with transportation. So transportation, there is an industry standard of state of good repair. So I will say, having worked on the previous work group that did come to a consensus, did come up with a recommendation. Unfortunately, for reasons that we don't have to get into right now, that still disappoint me. We could have done something that I think would have been transformational. We didn't do it, so now we're back at the drawing board doing this effort. State of good repair was a standard that was discussed in that work group, and it was understood of what that meant. Now that's harder because I don't know what the industry standard would be if there is one for schools. There's a school maintenance report through the state interagency for school construction. And for parks, I don't know what that would be. And so I think the challenge is, again, I think this should focus on capacity. I think it's hard to talk about all needs if we allow for some consideration among the group to address the kind of the wear and tear of capacity related to repairs, without setting the expectation that this group is also looking at funding mechanisms to maintain all schools, to maintain all roads, and to maintain all parks. Because if it's too broad, again, it's a bigger lift.
I'm fine to remove repairs. I think the word itself can be confusing.
Yeah.
What would it read if we removed repair? I think I'm leaning that direction too.
It would say the work group will determine and assess the county's schools, transportation, and parks needs to include net new infrastructure and upgrading existing infrastructure to levels that meet anticipated future demand.
Do you think that's the place I'm having, like, why I leaned into repairs? Because it's just talking about future. And if we have a location in which we are not meeting current needs, then repairs did that for me, but I hear that it's not clear. I mean, is it too much to say to levels that meet current and anticipated future demand?
I'm okay with that. I think because the word repair is not there. So, yeah.
So repairs, you
Take out
remove
repairs.
and say meet current demand, which in some ways implies bringing things that aren't meeting current demand to current demand without saying the word repairs.
Yes.
Yeah, my only sensitivity here is one of the issues with impact taxes, to me, one of the main issues in impact taxes is the assumption that it's the new development that's the problem.
Right.
It's the belief that an already overcrowded school should be addressed by penalizing a new development and residents that had nothing to do with the existing overcrowding that exists at that school. Overwhelmingly, we have had policies for decades, one of which we got rid of in the last council,
Right.
but that took an existing challenge that was created by the existing community, and we penalized the new members of the community or aspiring members of the community where they had to pay for it. That's why I called it a country club mentality of, we were saying, listen, we have problems at our club, so we're gonna charge you a higher initiation fee to be part of our exclusive club, and that will solve our problem, as opposed to everybody pitching in and being part of the solution because everybody was part of the challenge. It's not to say that new development doesn't add to capacity, it does, but it's to say that existing capacity challenges are not caused by people who aren't here yet. By definition, it's impossible. And so I'm just a little bit concerned if we're setting the expectation where we have schools, we have transportation that has not been maintained properly, maybe hasn't been funded to be maintained properly, maybe it just hasn't been taken care of properly, but for whatever reason, we have maintenance challenges, and we're gonna set up a funding regime that may be asking folks who had nothing to do with that lack of maintenance to pay to fix those maintenance problems. That doesn't seem fair, and it seems to kind of fall into the same trap that impact taxes have.
But I think we can charge the working group with that because we are saying I would say that wouldn't be equitable or sustainable for our community if we ultimately got a proposal back that just said, okay, we're going to continue to put all the burden on the new development that we're doing now. Because to me, that's just running in place because that's what we're doing now. And what we're asking this work group to do is to think about other funding mechanisms to move us forward that are equitable, predictable, and sustainable, and that will allow us to meet our needs for our schools, transportation, and parks now and into the future. So, Kelly, did you want to come up and speak?
They can hear me from
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
I think that, I don't know if this is fully addressing your issue, but for transportation, we have a set of complete street standards that I think would be highly preferable to use than demand. Because demand can be very confusing. I could demand to drive my car around on a bunch of 5-minute trips a day, or I could demand to walk everywhere. And those require really different types of infrastructure. Whereas if I'm saying I'm taking the existing infrastructure we already have and bringing it up to a standard that we've already say meet some of our safety and sustainability and other goals, that gives us a clear marching order and path, and we can come up with a cost estimate for that. Whereas the demand itself might be different based on modes and preferences. I can't speak for schools and parks on whether there's a similar standard that they've already adopted.
Really quickly, note from the clerk, can you state your name? For
Sorry, Haley Peckett.
No, sorry, that was mine. Sorry. Thank you, Ms. Peckett. So, yeah.
Could I make a suggestion? Could we eliminate repairs and add maybe this is imperfect, but to include net new infrastructure and upgrading existing infrastructure to levels that meet capacity needs and county policy standards. So that would allow for transportation to have the standard of complete street guidelines, park standard that we could set or that could be established.
I think that's good.
Sorry, one more time. Capacity needs and
County policy standards.
policies.
So then it's our policy that we're setting and saying, we want to meet our own policy. What would it cost to do that, and how do we pay for it? Which I think is a fair way to do it. So then we would get rid of repairs.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a good one.
Would you like me to read both final objectives?
Why would we want that?
The work group will determine and assess the county's schools, transportation, and parks infrastructure needs to include net new infrastructure and upgrading existing infrastructure to levels that meet capacity needs and county policy standards. Objective 2 would be the work group will research a variety of funding mechanisms to fund future capacity needs for schools, transportation, and parks. The work group must consider new funding mechanisms in addition to reform of the current impact tax system. The objective is funding mechanisms that are equitable, predictable, and sustainable without undermining county priorities such as housing, climate resiliency, and economic development.
I like that.
Right, I think this camel was being built nicely.
All right, on to
Number 2.
no, we didn't know. That was number 2.
Yeah.
Number
Number 2, sorry, number 3.
Wow.
Been a little bit more productive.
I was gonna say, let's go back to 2 just for the fun of it, yeah.
So number 3 at the bottom of page 4 of the staff report was additional recommendations for including racial equity and social justice. In the beginning of the resolution, there's a paragraph that talks about that evidence suggests impact taxes have a negative impact on eliminating racial disparities and inequities in the county. The resolution does in the final report require the work group to explain how the proposed funding mechanisms align with the values of racial equity and social justice, but that's kind of the only reference in the actual things that the work group is tasked with. So after speaking to OLO, there's a few recommendations on page 5. First is a set of questions that the work group could be required to answer. Those are questions about equitable community engagement, context and data on racial and social inequity, alignment with best practices, anticipated RESJ impacts, and then equitable implementation. So you could require the work group to answer these questions in its final report and even in that halfway report. Additionally, OLO did a racial equity and social justice policy handbook on land use, housing, and economic development. You could, in addition to or instead of, require the work group to just review that report in making their recommendations and find ways to incorporate it in their proposed funding mechanisms. I have read the report. It's a pretty great.
Any thoughts on?
I'm fine with that.
I'm fine with putting that as, put it as something that's in the final report or in their halfway that they address, how they're incorporating, these questions and having them review the, racial equity and social justice policy handbook on land use, housing and economic development.
So include both in the final and the.
Just kind of as an
Final
update of like, yeah.
But I do think in the interim, they'd be wise to do it as well so that we can figure out whether they're doing
Yeah.
what we need at the end.
And I will add that to towards the end of the resolution when it talks about their reporting.
So what exactly are we adding? I just want to make sure.
Yeah.
That the work group
Language.
will be required to answer this list of questions, which I could keep the way it's written in the staff report if the phrasing there all sounds right. And that also that they'll be required to review the handbook and incorporate its recommendations into their review.
I'm wondering if it would be, yeah, that's what I'm thinking. It's a, sorry, I'm just looking at what we have, the final, the work group, I'm looking at page 3 of the resolution. The work group was our final report to the council about a data-driven assessment proposed, equitable.
C.
I'm wondering if it's just putting this, something like including addressing the following and just putting what is in italics, the headlines.
Okay.
And then we could give the work group the more detailed document to help guide them. It seems like adding all of this to the actual resolution is a bit more than we usually would do.
Okay, so including addressing the following and then just the highlighted
Equitable
parts.
community engagement,
Yeah.
context, data on racial and social. Equity, excuse me.
Yeah,
And what I might do is separate C, so it'll be C can be 1, the environmental, safety, economic, and then D will become including these pieces, and then data analysis to support will become E. I'll just add a new one so C is
Yeah.
not too long.
that works.
Okay. And then the reference to reading the report, do you want me to put it in that list as well?
I don't know, or we could just,
I think it's understood and we
Yeah,
can just
give it
give
to
that guidance.
yeah,
In order to do this, reading the
Yeah.
report would be the tool that
Yeah.
gets them there. From my perspective.
yeah, I'm not sure we, in the actual
I
resolution.
think that's.
Yeah.
Understood. Number 4?
Mhm.
So number 4 is the composition of the work group.
Other question of the hour.
That's the easiest one.
So in total, as introduced, if I counted correctly, there are 14 people currently in the work group. If it's county departments, 3 council staff, park and planning has 3, 2 from planning, 1 from parks, state highway, and then MCPS as well. The departments listed are DOT, finance, OMB, DPS, and DHCA. And then each is just chosen by whoever their respective director is. This is where I think the bulk of our feedback has come from. When it was drafted, the idea was all the members would be, government people who work for the county in these capacities, and so could assess the various infrastructure needs, hopefully fairly easily. The resolution did require that the work group do stakeholder outreach, including meeting with both developers and community members, and then also opportunities for public feedback. The overarching idea here from council staff, the recommendation would be to just consider the size of the work group and the amount of time they have. So I think I'm going to first read through everyone that's been requested to be added, and then on page 7, there's sort of a list of considerations with each one. So first, to add an industry representative. This was, I think, Councilmember Glass and Councilmember Friedsen's memo should be in the staff report. The idea here is that industry representatives would have an important expertise and insights. The county executive asked to add an additional person from Department of Transportation, since MCPS has 2 representatives. Testimony suggested adding someone from DGS for the projects that are not under DOT. Also adding Montgomery College, since they're similar to MCPS. The planning board had suggested adding some of the utilities as infrastructure is broadened, but I think you can strike that one based on your prior recommendations. The Commission on Aging asked to add someone from DHHS to make it a more inclusive work group. Commission on Aging also asked for civic groups and community members. And then also there's been testimony to remove somebody, which is removing SHA, since the group is about county needs. So there's 2 options here. You can go through the list, see who to add, who to subtract, and so forth. But before that, you could also consider just increasing the outreach requirements. They're admittedly not super specific in the resolution. The idea was the work group will figure out its schedule and how to do that outreach. One option is to just say to the work group, you must meet with the following groups at maybe not the following times, but in the beginning or at the final report or at some point in the process. So that's one idea, is instead of growing the work group, just being specific about the outreach requirements. Alternatively, or actually probably in addition, adding to the final report that all the feedback received should be attached to the final report so that the council can review it. So those are the 2 options before you add and subtract people.
Can I ask, why do we have multiple people from each agency? I mean, if someone's expertise is from that agency, why do we need 3 people sitting there saying, I agree with you? I don't know. And I do believe we need to keep the work group to a workable size. Because I've been on boards where, and nobody ever wants to leave, I mean, but I think that we don't, I don't know why we need multiple agencies. I mean, I don't know why you need 2 from MCPS to, if MCPS has 2, we want 2. I think that causes an issue. And I agree with the whole idea that for state highway, they're not, we certainly need to talk to them, but they're shouldn't be part of what we're doing. And I do believe that we should have people to outside of government. I mean, the fact that only government is coming up with these ideas is not the idea for this. This is, if you're working in Virginia, how is Virginia helping and does it work over there? So that's where I am. I don't know why we need 3 members or 2 members from each group.
One idea too, having served on a couple of these work groups, you could also make some people non-voting members, which means they'd be in the work group, they'd be participating, of course. But at the end of the day, if there's disagreement on things and the work groups decides to vote on what recommendations go forward, you could say maybe DOT has 1 voting member But that doesn't mean that more people from DOT couldn't attend, of course, because also these meetings will be open to the public.
Right.
So,
So why don't we go to B and hold A in this section? Because I think regarding outreach, and let's nail down the composition, what we would recommend, and then go to the outreach. And why don't we start where I think there's agreement with the industry representation, given Council Member Friedson's recommendation and what I think I'm hearing from Councilmember Cass.
Yes,
So
I agree.
Councilmember Friedson, do you want to?
Yeah, appreciate it. I think we need two outside stakeholders. A for-profit housing developer and a not-for-profit housing developer. Those financing structures are different. The impact of what this would mean would be different. I think those perspectives are both critical to this conversation of what the real world impact would have. And that allows us to at least have the perspective at the table to balance the other priorities as discussed related to housing and to
Good with that?
Absolutely.
Now we're adding two people.
So, but I do think we can take away.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to go.
Watch this space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we're in agreement there, a recommendation on that. Thank you, Councilmember Friedson. Let's turn to, and I think it's the first bullet under B from the staff report, the perspective of, again, keeping this manageable, that we keep it at one DOT representative and just put it as one MCPS representative. And that way, if other people from MCPS want to come there, weigh in, but we have one representative on the working group.
I agree with that. I do think there's a question of some of the other executive departments of, for instance, DHCA. It's unclear to me what DHCA's role is in this, and even permitting. Is it to understand when in the process you could charge a fee? I mean, to me, that you don't have to be a voting member. They could be invited to a meeting to discuss that, but it is unclear to me. DHCA and DPS don't necessarily have a policy role in this. I'm just wondering whether or not they need to be included. In the interest of trying to keep this to a manageable
Yeah.
group.
Right. All right, so
I think it's back.
Oh, sorry, Ms. Beckett, did you want to?
The only thing I was gonna say on DPS, and this is more speaking from the executive's point of view than DOT, is they have a pretty strong role in terms of making sure that development moves forward and what restrictions on development occur. So that was I think, rationale for their inclusion. I'll defer to the committee.
Yeah, I think the
Yeah.
better way to do that is the actual people that DPS is interacting with, which is the for-profit and the not-for-profit developer. So to me, I'm not sure it's not, I mean, if the goal was, I get it, if the goal was to keep it as a government group, having the perspective of this is how projects actually move forward or don't move forward, and the timing of that, because the other executive departments are less ear to the ground, so to speak. Planning would have a role in that, and DPS would have a role in that, of really understanding what that looks like. But we've now included the actual people whose perspective they were going to be able to provide. So I'm not sure we need them. And we have the housing perspective from the actual housing providers. So it's not clear to me when we're talking about funding. DHCA has housing programs that they fund. That's not what this is funding. It's not like recordation taxes where we're talking about funding rental assistance or something, which some of recordation tax goes to, or the HIF or something along those lines. And so in the interest of trying to keep this to a manageable group, I'm not sure that those two executive departments would be necessary. I think DOT, absolutely. And I think we should talk about whether SHA, I think that's a reasonable question of what role the state would have.
Right. So just so we keep track of, so I think the committee, this was an agreement on one DOT, one MCPS.
Yes.
So we did that. I just want to get that on the record. Make sure we didn't lose that.
So we're net plus one, right?
Right, yeah,
Just
we're net
in
plus
terms
one.
of the size of a manageable or unmanageable
Right.
group.
And then the question is, now that we added two representatives from the development community, considering taking out DPS and DHCA. And it doesn't mean they wouldn't be consulted, obviously. It's just that who is on this working group working together, I'm okay removing them as,
I am as well, but the question that I have is like, for instance, the three members of council central staff, are they bringing three different viewpoints? Why do we have three members?
I believe the idea was that since the analysts have different portfolios, so you might
Yes.
want the transportation analyst, the planning analyst, and a schools analyst. Or an economic
But
development
you're
analyst.
saying for voting members, I mean,
Yeah.
many times the
Yeah.
analysts don't vote. Or I don't know, the analysts vote on.
But for a working group that
Yeah,
we're
we're
setting
setting
up
up.
to have our perspective, I think
There
we
are
want the
voices,
perspective of our analysts that oversee the subject matter areas in the same way that the executive has a transportation person, a finance person, office of management and budget person. I think it would be a significant error to not have the perspectives of the subject matter experts that we have at the council at the table with a full voice.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think I hadn't thought of it exactly that way. I think that, that for them to vote is different than what we've gone through for analysts before, but I do think you need their
Well,
thoughts.
Just to be clear, departments don't vote either. I mean, nobody here votes. This is a working group that we're setting up to make recommendations. The
Right.
goal is this is a consensus building group where it's not a split vote or, a contentious dynamic, but you need somebody to have membership formally on the committee if there is a vote or if there are decisions to be able to provide that perspective.
And I agree that, but you were talking about voting and non-voting members.
Yes, sorry.
That's-
So that's if the work group on its own, like the council doesn't have to tell the work group that they
Right.
have to vote on things. If they're unanimous, they have their list of recommendations, excellent. But sometimes in these work groups, there's disagreement. And so it would just, shocking. And so it would basically be saying that here are the members of the work group who get to vote if the work group decides they need to vote on things. So the council staff analyst would basically represent the council.
I can,
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we need to set non-voting members. I think the committee can fully decide who the subject matter experts they want to bring to the table. I think we set who is on the committee to make sure that we have the right perspectives at the table, and then they can expand from there.
Mhm.
But I don't think we need to set, voting members and ex officio or non-voting members. I think we set the number, we set the
Mhm.
group. We try to make it a manageable number because that was a major feedback that we had is don't make this too big,
Yep.
or else it'll be impossible to come to a consensus.
Right. So right now we're at 13, I think,
Yes.
if I'm keeping track correctly. All right. Planning currently has two, I'm on bullet number 2.
This might go back to Councilmember Katz's point about duplicate representatives. Planning was given to because they draft the DIP and the impact tax bill. But if you were looking for a reduction, you could reduce it to 1, keeping in mind that they will also have a separate parks representative.
Well, but those are very different
Yeah,
functions,
they
I
are.
They
will
are.
say, and I also think even within planning, there are multiple functions. There is the regulatory review function. If you think about like the executive, splits it up into different departments, we are talking about park and planning as if it's executive government. But that's not the way that
Yeah.
we've broken it down. Now, we could delineate exactly like it should be one regulatory review person at park and planning and one policy person at
I
park
like
and
that.
planning.
Mhm.
I think that would be fine
I
to
like
show
that.
the difference.
Yeah.
Um,
it's to get the different viewpoints at the table so that everybody at the table understands how you got to where you got.
Yeah.
could we ask, we have
It
representatives
is
from park and planning. Is there a way besides how I've framed it, regulatory review and research? Is there a way to frame that better from the agency perspective?
Please give voting for the record. I think the first way you framed it, regulatory and policy, would be the most
Policy.
accurate way. Policy,
Yeah.
the countywide policy and planning drafts the growth and infrastructure policy
Correct.
that reviews the impact taxes. But I do think the regulatory framework is very important to have there, and they're two very different functions along with parks, which is also very.
Yeah, so,
Yes.
so two with, one, regulatory expertise and one with policy
Yes.
expertise.
Yeah.
Because I do think those are two very different things. One is doing a project by project dynamic that is more of, what we, want on the actual implementation of what this is actually going to mean. And then there's the policy side of it how does this impact the growth and infrastructure policy? What are the, puts and takes and the broader dynamics.
Okay.
So that's bullet 2.
Yeah.
Bullet 3 was the MCPS, SHA, and parks, where we got various arguments on both sides. The first argument heard was that are there members of the group who might have a bias because they benefit from the CIP? I think that argument may be moot now since we are, of course, adding the developer community. I think with SHA it was a little more specific even in that they are not the county, and this is a group about county funding. So those are the arguments there for that bucket.
Yeah, the question on SHA would be, are the funding mechanisms going to relate to state projects? Or is this county funding mechanisms for county projects? And then if not, what perspective is state highway providing?
Right. Yeah.
I'm fine not to have state highway on there. First of all, I don't think you'll get anyone on the work group from state highway that's going to be the funding person. So anyhow,
I think they can the work group can request and invite state highway to come and talk about county funding for shared state county projects, because there are many examples of shared state county projects, but bus rapid transit would be a good significant example of that, but I don't think that we need it as a member.
Yeah. Or a 12.
Here's my other question. Is it okay to have an even number if the group could vote? I think it's fine.
Yeah.
yeah, I do too. Let that be the problem.
Because I think the recommendation could be, this was a 6-6.
Yeah.
And-
Okay,
Because I also think that we should discuss whether or not we're expecting one final recommendation of this is exactly what we're suggesting that the council do, or that this group comes up with options, a series of recommendations or options, or considerations for, to be presented to the council to choose among.
But I think in terms of members composition, unless somebody I appreciate the other feedback we received, but I don't believe there is anyone else from the feedback we received that should actually be a member of the working group versus someone who the working group engages with.
And I think we solved some of that problem by narrowing the scope.
Yeah.
One of the challenges of the broader scope was understandably, if you're talking about all infrastructure needs, what about libraries? What about DHHS? What about Department of Recreation? What about all of these various stakeholder groups? But since we have narrowed it and tailored it, I think we've addressed most of those dynamics in that sense.
and not to throw any, but for the municipalities that have zoning authority, are they under this funding? How does that work for them? I don't remember him.
That is a good question. They should still be subject to impact taxes. So they are affected in that way.
So the question becomes whether or not you'd have one person on this group that would be from a municipality that has zoning authority, planning and zoning authority.
I think maybe that would be an ex officio non-voting.
Well, if we're going to do that, then we shouldn't have,
Yeah.
because I really don't believe we should have voting, because then it means that they're not an equal member. So
I think
I
maybe
think
we
we
make
should
a
go
reference to consult the municipalities.
Okay, yeah,
I
that's
think it's a
fine.
good point, but
I
I
agree.
think we keep the
I think we keep it.
membership relatively
Yeah.
tight.
okay, that's
Yeah.
fine.
I do think we need to consult them because we had to do an amendment to the last
Yeah.
bill that we talked about because municipalities weren't included. But I would say, yeah.
So when we talk about the outreach and engagement, can
Yes.
we just specifically note municipalities?
Municipalities. Yeah.
Okay, so on the members, real quick, just to summarize, We're gonna add a for-profit developer, add a
Nonprofit,
nonprofit developer, remove one MCPS representative,
Mhm.
remove DHCA, remove DPS, remove state highway.
Yep,
Okay, and then for outreach, the list I have so far, if you want to specify who outreach should be to, would be SHA, DPS, DHCA, and municipal.
But I think it should be worded, it says including, but not limiting to.
right,
Yeah,
yeah.
And then, of course, a public feedback.
Exactly,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we need to specifically note consulting our own departments. I mean, I think that seems a little odd to me. I think the more important engagement is with external stakeholders,
Yeah.
the public, and municipalities.
Yeah, and I like the idea of having the feedback received in the final report.
Any specifications on when to meet, how to meet, et cetera, or would you like to leave that to the work?
I think
it
just
should
leave it to the worker, yeah.
be. The only other question, since everything's only the last question I have to say, but it's at what point, what does consult mean? I mean, are they consulting? So how, they need to make people aware, the various groups aware of what they're doing and how they're doing it and get the feedback, but it shouldn't be just one time and done. I mean, it should be throughout the process.
It could be, I think for some of these groups, like for the public, it'd probably be helpful to have like one, I believe we don't call them public hearings. We call them
Yeah, town halls
different,
or
yeah,
like a
whatever.
town
Yeah.
hall. And then maybe you say to have a meeting with municipalities and the SHA, so they're actually like meeting in person.
Right,
And then to say before the final report, to just check in for additional feedback.
Mm-hmm,
that would be,
Yeah.
that would make me more comfortable.
yeah,
Things, and
Right,
then
'cause I
check
think
in
that-
before
yeah.
final report with what the recommendations
recommendations
are
are,
going to
right.
be.
It shouldn't be like a big reveal. It's not a
Yeah.
surprising everyone. Great, so now chair or facilitator, I think.
Yes, is the, well, not the last one.
Close, stay close.
So 3 options, well, sort of 2.5 options here. One, it's a chair and vice chair or a facilitator. And then also in testimony, there was a question about having the work group hire someone to do research. So going through each of those, first, recommendation for a chair is someone from council central staff or some other council function. Examples, OLO, somebody who works for the council, since it is a council work group, would be an appropriate liaison to report back to council as needed. A vice chair might be helpful, but you can let the chair or the work group decide if they'd like a vice chair, since this would be in addition to that person's regular work duties. The alternative is a facilitator, which would of course require going through the contract and procurement process, which costs money and time, but the idea there was to get an outside perspective. So those are the 2 options for who would be managing the group. The idea here is whoever this person is, chair, facilitator, would be creating the agendas, coordinating the groups, scheduling the meetings, making sure the final report is completed and submitted, and then being the contact person. So those are sort of the roles and personality and skills that this person would need to have.
So I can start. My preference would be, I think option 1, the chair of the central staff, chairing this meeting. I think a number of reasons. 1, timing. I think we've heard that, we've given a timeline here, but folks would like us to do this faster. I think it's understanding the breadth of the issue, and what the council perspective is, and really understanding what the council wants out of this work group is really important. And even if we were to go to a facilitator is someone who facilitates the meeting and needs to understand and have a depth of knowledge. But in my mind, they're not having an influence over this conversation. And so I think we have staff who could do this and do it well. And I think it also helps us as a council and particularly this committee, touch base, understand how the work group is going and to do it in a timely fashion.
So I agree, and I would suggest we just do 3 members of council central staff, including the chair, to be chosen by the executive director.
Good
We
point.
can live with that.
Yep.
Oh, actually, so if it's 3 members of council staff, including the chair of each of the, so strike that the council will pick who the chair is, if the director is gonna pick.
I would be
I'm
fine
fine
with
with the
that.
director. I
Yeah.
think the director, that's why
I
we
think
have.
the director is
that's
picking the
why
3
we have-
members and choosing among those members, the chair. I think
Yeah,
that's appropriate.
That's,
Yep.
yeah.
Okay. And then for the data analyst is how I rephrase the testimony. Council staff's recommendation here is if the work group is made up of experts who
Yeah.
should be able to gather this info. But if the work group feels that that is something that they need, they can reach out to council either and
Yeah.
bring that
Yep.
mid-report and you can consider it then.
Yep.
Because that person would also have to go through contract and procurement.
Yep.
Agreed.
So lastly is what should the final report include? There's already been some changes to this
Yep.
section that we've made previously. One thing to note here, though, is the county executive recommended accelerating the timeline so that the final report is due in December and can be factored into next year's budget.
I think it's already an aggressive
Yes.
timeline, to be honest with you, and I don't want to set unrealistic expectations to the public
Yeah.
or to colleagues or to ourselves.
Yep.
So I think keeping it as it is already going to be hard for them to meet.
Yep. I agree.
I mean, I agree, but if they can come back with it faster, they shouldn't hold it.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
But say that you have to do it under this timeframe, how they gonna do it?
Yeah.
Now, actually, that makes me think, I think the phrasing is okay. It says by June 30th, so hopefully that implies
Right.
it's faster than great.
Yeah.
Right, that.
That's everything. All right.
Wow.
So we'll put this together and bring it to full council. And then I just want to say thank you, Ms. Nadeau, for all your hard work on this. Thank you to the representatives of Department of Transportation and Planning and for coming today. And thank you to all of our central staff, Mr. Ali, for being here. I know this has been a great deal of thought and work has gone into this, and we really appreciate all of that and look forward